Welcome to the third lecture in the Chapter 10 series. In this lecture, we are going to be talking about communication and family relationships. We'll talk a little bit about what constitutes a family, and then we will look at some specific communication behaviors that are important in families and maintaining family relationships. So what constitutes a family? There are a few different ways to think about what brings, what constitutes or what makes a family. How we define family would be another way of saying this. So really thinking about family as being a really diverse concept, being really hard to define. And so we have a few different ways of defining what makes a family. The first is thinking about family types. So we can be and think about family in a few different ways. The first would be our families of origin. So really thinking about the family that we grew up in. This often consists of your parents or caregivers and potential siblings that you might have. And so for many of you, your families of origin right now are probably your kind of primary way that you think about and view family. As individuals continue throughout the lifespan, they may decide to have a family of procreation. And this would be happen when an individual begins to start their own family, whether through committing to another individual and adding children to their family, either through birth or by adoption. Or other means. So thinking about, you at that point you would still have your family of origin, but then you'd also have your family of procreation. And the last family type is family of choice. And so we know that there are instances where people feel like family, or we refer to them like family, we treat them like family, but they may not necessarily fall into the two categories of family of origin or family of procreation. And so thinking about, when you are at school, when you're young, you have very close friends, and so you might think about maybe like your Bloomsburg family or your volleyball family, people that you spend a lot of time with, that you're really close with, that you treat and consider to be like family or similar to family. And these would be considered families of choice. And so really thinking about there are many, these three primary family types, and we can belong to multiple of these families, maybe even all three. So thinking about, the family that you came from, that you were born into, and that you grew up with, your family of procreation, and your family of choice. There are other ways of defining families as well. And so here we get into some of the aspects of thinking about family, maybe from like a policy perspective. So thinking about how we define family make to make laws, to make decisions about things like policies in schools. And so when we think about many of those things, we often think about these policies and rules being guided by genetic ties. So thinking about family as being people who are related to you by blood. But we know that it's a fairly limited perspective here, because we know there are many family individuals who have family ties who do not share a genetic component. So we think about things like adoption. But also we know that just because two people share genetic material doesn't necessarily make them family. And so, there are some other ways that we can think about constituting or defining family. The second is legal obligations. So thinking about being a family because you are legally bound either through marriage or adoption or step family relations. All of these things would fall into that kind of category. And the last one really kind of maps onto these families of choice, this idea of role behaviors. This concept says that, kind of the role that the person serves in your life really defines whether they are part of your family. So if you have a best friend who's not legally tied to you, there's no genetic component, but that person acts like a sister or they act like a brother, they're part of your family, you've brought them in, then because of role behaviors, that person, would then could potentially. You could classify them as part of your family. So role behaviors really focuses on what makes a family act like a family. Are they living together? Do they care for one another? Are they loving one another? Do they use family terms? And so I've had students talk about how they have a Aunt Cindy, who is not related to them by any legal means or genetic means, but it's their mom's best friend, and it's been a part, come to all their family get-togethers, been to their birthdays, all of these things. And so they've used that term aunt, even though, if we think about it genetically or legally, that person is not, that person's aunt. And so thinking about some of these different characteristics and how we could use them to define family, either in a broad sense or to really kind of limit how we think about families. So we know that there are some common communication behaviors in families. The first is family roles. So we've talked a little bit about that in terms of thinking about family position. So the position that you have in a family are based on kind of the structure of your relationship with others, whether you're the mom, you're the dad, you're the firstborn. These often are based on social and emotional functions and an individual behavior within the family. But when we think about family roles, these are different from family positions. And so roles really embody the function that individuals serve in the family system. So you might be the problem solver, you might be the peacemaker, you might be the black sheep, you could be the, comedian, you might be the person who makes the decision. So, think about, when I'm in class, I usually ask students, like, who in your family makes the decisions? And usually it's a parent, and usually it's the mom. So thinking about who in your family makes the decisions, who's the enforcer, who was the disciplinarian. And so we can really think about how these roles in the family serve really important functions and help the family system kind of work, but they also oftentimes are related to family positions. And so these two things, although they are different, they are related in pretty fundamental ways. So as we think about family rituals, these are important practices or traditions in the family. They're usually made up of repetitive behaviors that have some sort of special meaning or serve some sort of function in the family. Family rituals are important because they reinforce a family's values. They provide a sense of belonging. It's usually a time when families coming together and spending quality time with each other. Family rituals can be really important for socializing new members of the family. So thinking about, if we have like a certain Christmas tradition, maybe you come together, you have a special meal, or my family had a tradition where we would open one present on Christmas Eve before, Christmas morning. And so this could be a time when we kind of socialize new members into what it means to be a part of the family. During rituals is usually when we have our third communication behavior occurring, which is family stories. And so during family rituals, family stories are usually really important to teaching new family members the family values, the family rules, the kind of expected behaviors in that family, as well as the history of the family. So family storytelling and family rituals oftentimes go one in one. Family stories are then essentially narratives that are central to a family's identity. They give the family a sense of their history. Family members are able to express kind of what they expect of one another, how they feel about one another. They reinforce connections across different generations. And they often have two common characteristics. Family stories are often told and retold, often over long periods of time. So they become a part of the family's collective knowledge, a part of the family's fabric. So when we think about maybe your birth story, so kind of how you came to be, and maybe how we talked a little bit about your name and how maybe you heard stories in that naming activity of how you got your name, and maybe you've heard that story over and over and over and over again, and so that's become a part of your collective knowledge of who you are. Family stories also convey an underlying message about the family's identity. So they may send messages about the values and belief systems of the family, like we never quit, we always stick together, family over everything else. And family stories are an important way to communicate those values across the different family members. The last common communication in families that was discussed in your chapter is family secrets. And so family secrets are um, kind of a component of privacy in the family. So we can kind of look back a little bit to communication privacy management theory that we talked about in romantic relationships and think about how privacy boundaries and joint ownership of information and privacy rules could function in families as well as romantic relationships. We know that some families have secrets that are intentionally hidden. Maybe there's something that you and your siblings hide from your parents, or vice versa. We know that families as a unit sometimes keep secrets from people outside of the family unit. So maybe if you're struggling financially or you have experiencing addiction in your family, you may not share that outside of the family. That would be a family secret that is not shared with the kind of external boundary. And family secrets often contain information the family considers to be private or inappropriate for sharing with outsiders or even with certain family members. So we have reasons for keeping these secrets in our families, and those can vary depending on what those secrets are. So the other thing that you were introduced to through your individual activity for today is the theory of family communication patterns. Communication patterns is really important when we are thinking about family relationships and communication in family relationships. It's the primary theory of family communication. And so I really want to go through some of that today and really extend on some of what you read in your worksheet about family communication patterns on the kind of the second page or back of that survey where you determined what your family communication pattern was. I had some information for you to read, and we're just going to go over some of that today. So family communication patterns essentially are fairly stable and predictable ways that families communicate with one another. They're important for creating the family's shared social reality. So this theory suggests that we have these very patterned and predictable ways that a family has come up with to kind of the norms. So we can think about these as the norms or expectations for how family members should communicate with one another. And through these processes of communication is how we kind of create what it means, kind of the reality of our family, really weaving in the intricate fabric of who the family is and what it means to be a member of that family. Family communication patterns guide how families talk about difficult topics. They encompass how families make decisions. So many of the important all the things that we talked about just a moment ago are heavily influenced by these patterned ways that families prefer or have established that they are going to communicate with one another. And so as you saw in your worksheet for this lecture, there were two important dimensions or patterns, communication patterns, that families can fall either high or low on. And the first dimension is conversation orientation. And conversation orientation is essentially the degree to which families create a climate in which all family members are encouraged to participate in unrestrained interaction about a wide array of topics. And so when we think about conversation orientation, we know that families can buy into this idea that we have open, frequent conversations. All members of the family can contribute equally to communication processes like decision making. We communicate about a wide variety of topics, maybe even when we don't agree with that information. Kind of I might think of this as more like an potentially egalitarian approach to communication in the family. And so, children would be comfortable talking about maybe things that they know their parents don't agree with, voicing their opinions in the decision-making process and things of that nature. So really thinking about conversation orientation as if we score very high on this dimension, we have these like really frequent open exchanges where we can clearly articulate how we feel about certain things without any kind of maybe like stigma or anything like that. We also have conformity orientation. And so conformity orientation simply is the degree to which the family communication environment stresses kind of this climate of homogeneity of attitudes, beliefs, and values. And so here we really see kind of a hierarchical structure within the family and communication. So thinking about what is the kind of structure, and oftentimes in families that are score high in conformity orientation, there is a hierarchical structure. So the parents have the primary say. You may think about this in terms of like, don't speak unless you're spoken to. That is kind of a very dramatic example. But really thinking about kind of parents having the authority in the family, and we might see more like taboo topics. So there's things that the family don't necessarily talk about here. And so really thinking about this as being less of, the kind of unrestrained approach that we saw in conversation orientation, but not necessarily. We can still have fairly high levels of conversation orientation as well as conforming to the kind of homogeneity that we see, or this kind of hierarchical structure that we see in conformity orientation. So an important thing to, the kind of the second main feature of the family communication patterns theory is the interaction between these two dimensions. And so as you saw in your worksheet, when we're determining what our family communication patterns are in our family, we look at whether we score high or low on conversation orientation and whether we score high or low on conformity orientation. And these two orientations interact to create family types. And so as we think about the family types, 4 family types being protective, consensual, laissez-faire, and pluralistic, these again were outlined in your activity for today. And we're going to talk about each of these family types and specifically think about how they represent these two dimensions of conversation orientation and conformity orientation, and maybe kind of looking at the landscape of what this looks like, communication in these families look like. So the first is protective families, and protective families have they're high in conformity orientation and low in conversation orientation. So we see a lot of that kind of hierarchical structure. The communication in these families is characterized by obedience to parental authority. There's really little concern for conceptual matters of open communication. So we really see this top-down structure. We see a strong endorsement for all family members adhering to the same value systems, the same belief systems, and so really thinking about what that looks like in the family. Consensual families are high on both conversation and conformity orientations. And so here we're really seeing family communication that's characterized by this tension between wanting to be open and have unrestrained conversation and exploring new ideas and really encouraging family members to speak up, while also wanting to have the kind of existing traditional hierarchy in the family, kind of that top-down structure of parents to children, and also wanting their children and wanting members of the family to kind of agree and have that homogeneity that we saw when scoring high on conformity orientation. So families struggle kind of between these two tensions. As we think about going back to our conversation of dialectical tensions, we could maybe think about some strategies that families and consensual families may use to navigate this tension between having that conformity but also wanting to have that kind of open lines of communication in the family. And some of you may be the consensual family type, and you would really know what that tension looks like. The third family type is laissez-faire families, and these families would be the opposite of consensual families. So they are low on conversation orientation and low on conformity orientation. And these family environments are usually characterized by not a lot of interaction. So, family members don't communicate very often with one another. Oftentimes these interactions are very structured. They don't have a lot of kind of emotion. They they oftentimes center around kind of that instrumental kinds of communication, so like kind of daily communication about tasks, and really involve fairly limited number of topics. And so here we see, not the family communication pattern that really doesn't communicate very often, or about a variety of topics. This would be a family pattern that's really characterized by individualism. So really thinking about the individuals in the family and less so much about kind of that family collective that we may see more of in families that are characterized by high levels of either of these dimensions. And the last family type is pluralistic. And so pluralistic families are high in conversation orientation, but low in conformity orientation. So here we're seeing that kind of open, unrestrained discussion. It may involve family members discussing a wide variety of topics that maybe they don't all agree on. We might see lots of debate kinds of interactions in these types of families, really debating, maybe hot button issues. You might think about, what does your, we could very easily picture kind of the family dinner environment here, and how each of these conversation or each of these family types, what that would look like in the kind of Thanksgiving dinner when all the family members are coming together, right? And here you'd see that lively debate of maybe politics or religion. People maybe don't agree on these things, but they're willing to talk about them in a very respectful way. And so that would be representative of kind of this pluralistic approach. So that summarizes our conversation on family communication relationships, or family relationships and communication within those relationships. The last lecture for this chapter 10 will be looking at communication in workplace relationships.